In 2014, a team at the University of Lyon cut into the bones of 45 Egyptian mummies, not searching for gold but for isotopes. They found chemical signatures locked inside collagen, teeth, and hair, signatures that record what a person ate across an entire lifetime. What they found overturned centuries of assumption. The laborers who built the pyramids carried markers of one of the healthiest diets ever documented. The royal elite carried markers of cardiovascular disease. Egypt's poorest workers ate better than Cleopatra, and the proof of why begins inside those bones. Inside a laboratory at the University of Lyon, fragments of ancient bone, teeth, and hair are transformed into a kind of chemical diary. Each tissue holds a different chapter of a person's life. Bone collagen, extracted from femurs or ribs, preserves a record of the last decade of meals. Dentine from a child's molar captures what someone ate in their earliest years. If hair survives, its layers reveal the final weeks before death, almost like a nutritional time-lapse. The Lyon team, led by Dr. Alexandra Zazo, set out to reconstruct these hidden stories with the precision of forensic science. Their toolkit is stable isotope analysis. Every bite of food leaves a subtle signature in the body's chemistry. Carbon isotopes, specifically the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 known as delta-13C, distinguish between plants like wheat and barley, which thrive on the Nile floodplain, and grains such as millet grown in drier soils. Nitrogen isotopes, measured as delta-15N, rise as you move up the food chain from plants to fish to livestock to humans. Sulfur isotopes, delta-34S, help separate protein that comes from land animals versus fish, since Nile fish absorb sulfur from water, not soil. Each sample in the study had to meet strict criteria before analysis. Collagen had to be well preserved, with a yield above 1% and a carbon-to-nitrogen ratio between 2.9 and 3.6. Out of 45 mummies, only those passing these benchmarks would yield trustworthy results. The team cross-checked their numbers using local animal bones and ancient plant remains, ensuring the isotope values truly reflected ancient diets and not contamination or decay. With this approach, the scientists could reconstruct not just what people ate, but how their diets shifted over a lifetime, and how different social groups, workers, priests, and nobles might have eaten differently. The method promised answers to questions that had lingered for centuries. But the real suspense lay in what these isotope diaries would reveal once the numbers began to speak. When the lab results came in, the numbers told a story that no ancient scroll or tomb painting could have predicted. Nearly every elite mummy in the Lyon study, including priests, nobles, and high officials, showed bone collagen values that pointed to a diet with less than 5% of its protein coming from aquatic sources. In a land where the Nile teemed with fish, the chemical traces in these bodies revealed almost none had made it to the tables of Egypt's most privileged. The Nile fish paradox is not just a quirk of the isotope data. Ancient Greek historians noticed it too. Herodotus, traveling Egypt in the 5th century BCE, wrote that priests refused to eat fish and considered it impure, abstaining even when fish was abundant on the banks of the Nile. In a society where religious law and social status shaped every meal, this taboo was more than superstition. It was a marker of identity, a boundary between sacred and profane. The isotope evidence backs up these ancient texts. Elite mummies, whose burials included gold amulets and linen shrouds, left behind chemical signatures of a diet built on wheat, barley, and the meat of livestock. Fish, despite its abundance, was almost entirely absent from their long-term protein intake. The priests, the very people who enforced food taboos, were the gatekeepers of this dietary divide. Their influence reached beyond temple walls, shaping what nobles and even royalty considered acceptable to eat. This finding overturns the popular image of Egyptian banquets groaning with river fish. Instead, it raises a new question. If the Nile's bounty was off limits to the elite, who actually ate the fish? The answer lies not in the palaces, but in the crowded workers' villages and the humble rations of those who built the monuments. The chemical diaries of the poor would soon reveal a very different story. At the base of the Giza Plateau, daily life for a pyramid builder was measured out in rations, not riches. The diary of Merer, an overseer, offers a rare window into this world. His papyrus records not only the movement of limestone, but the steady flow of food, jars of beer, baskets of bread, onions, and dried fish. Each worker's day began with bread, dense and coarse, baked from emmer wheat or barley, often gritty enough to wear down teeth over years. Beer, thick and nourishing, was brewed from the same grains, serving as both drink and meal under the desert sun. Merer's logs detail more than quotas. They reveal a supply chain that stretched from state-run granaries to the banks of the Nile. Archaeologists have uncovered charred barley, wheat husks, and fish bones at the workers' village, confirming the staples Merer described. The remains tell of Nile perch, tilapia, and catfish, dried and salted for storage. Pork bones, too, appear in the refuse, evidence that pigs were raised and slaughtered for the laborers, even as the elite avoided them. A typical ration was half a kilogram of bread, a liter of beer, beans or lentils, onions, and sometimes fish or pork. The calorie count often topped 2,500 a day, matching the demands of hauling stone. Everything was tracked, from the grain in storage to the fish caught in the river. The system prized predictability. Luxury was for others. Meals were repetitive, dictated by what the state could provide and the Nile could yield. Yet the combination of whole grains, legumes, fish, and allium vegetables offered a diet rich in fiber, plant protein, and micronutrients. No honeyed cakes or imported wine, just bread, beer, beans, onions, and fish. The food of necessity, portioned by bureaucrats, now echoes what nutritionists call balanced, humble but sustaining, fuel for the hands that built empires. Inside Cleopatra's palace, the banquet hall was a theater of appetite and ambition. The marble tables groaned under the weight of roasted wild boar, each animal imported at great expense from the Mediterranean. 8 were prepared for a single evening, though only a dozen guests would ever taste them. Stuffed pigeons, their bellies filled with herbs and pine nuts, arrived on silver platters, followed by spiced rabbit and marinated gazelle, meat so rare in Egypt that their presence alone spoke of power. Nile perch, the largest fish of the river, was caught not for the hungry but for display, its white flesh grilled and draped in sauces sweetened with figs and honey. The air in the hall shimmered with the scent of roasting meat, mingled with the perfume of date cakes and olive oil. Lentil soup bubbled in bronze cauldrons, thickened with barley and finished with coriander and garlic. Baskets of sweetened figs circled the table, each one a symbol of fertility and divine right. Wine flowed in crystal goblets, shipped from Greek islands and blended with local barley beer for lesser guests. The queen's cup was never empty, its rim dusted with gold leaf, the imported wine a sign of her reach beyond the Nile. These feasts were not only about pleasure. Every dish was a statement. Roasted boar and spiced game told visiting Romans that Egypt could match any luxury of the empire. Honeyed desserts, rich with fruit and nuts, signaled abundance in a land where such sweetness was rare. Cleopatra's table was a stage for alliances and rivalry, where the menu was as carefully chosen as the guest list. Yet beneath the spectacle, the food itself was heavy, dense with animal fat, sugars, and alcohol. The calories piled up in courses designed to impress, not to nourish. The queen's banquets dazzled the senses and the imagination, but their excess came at a cost that would only become clear centuries later. In the shadow of such opulence, the gap between the palace and the workers' village grew ever wider, measured not just in gold, but in every mouthful. Every mouthful in ancient Egypt was shaped not just by what the land produced, but by a web of sacred rules enforced by temple law. The priests, more than any pharaoh, decided what was pure and what was forbidden. Their authority reached into kitchens, markets, and even the fields, dictating who could eat what and when. Temple papyri from the New Kingdom lay out these boundaries with bureaucratic precision. Meat from cattle, sheep, and goats was reserved for sacrifices in the priesthood, with strict quotas for each festival. Wine, though grown in Delta vineyards, was rationed for religious ceremonies and high holidays. For ordinary days, beer brewed from barley was the drink of workers and artisans. But the most striking restriction concerned fish. Legal documents survived that list penalties for priests caught eating fish, including loss of rations, suspension from temple duties, and public shaming. Fish, abundant in the Nile, was declared ritually unclean for those serving in the sanctuaries. The law was not about scarcity. The river teemed with perch and catfish, but for the elite, eating them would risk spiritual impurity. The same logic applied to pork, which was avoided by priests but given to laborers as part of their rations. Redistribution was at the heart of the system. Livestock from temple herds and offerings was divided according to rank, with the choicest cuts going to high priests. Bread and beer flowed from temple bakeries to the staff, but always in measured amounts. Violations of these food laws brought swift consequences, recorded in the legal archives, including confiscated meat, reduced wine, and removal from sacred service. In this way, the rules of the temple enforced a dietary divide that was as much about power as about purity. The food laws did not reflect a lack of resources. They were an instrument of control, shaping the health and fate of every class in Egypt. In a darkened radiology suite in Cairo, a team of cardiologists and Egyptologists gathered around the flickering images of ancient hearts. The Horus study, named for the falcon-headed god, set out to answer a question no ancient scribe ever recorded. What did centuries of elite feasting do to the bodies of Egypt's privileged dead? Using 64-slice multi-detector CT scanners, the team examined 44 mummies, princes, priests, and nobles, each preserved with care and entombed for eternity. Their arteries, silent for millennia, now revealed their secrets one scan at a time. The results were striking. Nearly half of the mummies, 45%, showed clear evidence of atherosclerosis, hardened, calcified plaques lining the arterial walls. In modern medicine, these deposits are the warning signs of heart attack and stroke. The most dramatic case belonged to Princess Amos Mariette Amon, a royal of the 18th dynasty. CT images of her chest displayed massive calcium buildup in both coronary arteries. Her Agatston equivalent score, a modern measure of heart disease risk, exceeded 400, a level that today signals a high probability of cardiovascular events. She died between the ages of 18 and 22. Other elites showed similar patterns, dense calcifications in the aorta, carotid and femoral arteries, matching the distribution seen in contemporary patients with advanced artery disease. These findings stood in sharp contrast to what is known about the skeletons of ordinary workers, who rarely show such severe vascular disease. The evidence pointed to a direct link between the elite diet, rich in meat, saturated fat, and wine, and the early onset of heart disease, centuries before the modern epidemic. Yet the researchers cautioned that mummification, preservation bias, and post-mortem changes could exaggerate some findings. Even so, the pattern was too consistent to ignore. For Egypt's elite, privilege came with a hidden cost, written not in gold, but in the arteries of their hearts. So here is the direct answer. The everyday diet of Egypt's poorest workers, whole grain bread, beans, onions, and dried fish, matches almost perfectly with what modern medicine now calls the Mediterranean diet. The macronutrient profile is nearly identical, about 60% carbohydrates from whole grains and legumes, 15 to 20% protein from beans and fish, and the rest from healthy fats, mostly from seeds and pulses. When scientists compared this pattern to the modern Mediterranean diet in the landmark pre-dimed trial, they found a 30% reduction in major cardiovascular events compared to a low-fat control group. In other words, the food that fueled pyramid builders, simple, repetitive, and dictated by necessity, delivered the same protection against heart disease that today's nutritionists urge for long life. Cleopatra and her court, meanwhile, dined on red meat, sweetened cakes, imported wine, and rare delicacies. These foods dazzled guests, but they packed arteries with saturated fat and sugar. The irony is sharp. What was meant to display power and status led to hardening of the arteries. The rations of the poor, forced by scarcity and law, became the template for health. Prestige foods left a legacy of calcified hearts. The humble bowl of grain and bean outlasted the queen's banquet, echoing in the science of today. Pliny the Elder, writing a century after Cleopatra's reign, preserved a story that reads like a fable for the ages. At a banquet staged for Mark Antony, Cleopatra wagered she could serve the most expensive meal in history. The queen called for a goblet of vinegar and dropped in one of her legendary pearls, worth a fortune, the size of a quail's egg. As the pearl hissed and dissolved, Pliny described how she drank the cloudy liquid in a single swallow, turning mineral into spectacle, wealth into a fleeting taste. Modern chemistry confirms the trick. Calcium carbonate from the pearl reacts with acetic acid, releasing a swirl of carbon dioxide and calcium ions. The result is not a nourishing tonic, but a stinging solution, no more nutritious than a glass of sour water. Cleopatra's performance was a masterstroke of status, a show of power so extravagant it left even Antony speechless. Yet the pearl offered no sustenance, only the illusion of value. In the end, the most dazzling foods of the elite, pearls, gold leaf, wine laced with honey, delivered little but empty calories and fleeting glory. The real legacy belonged to the humble grain bowl, not the vanished pearl. Plutarch, writing a century after Cleopatra's death, preserves a final, haunting detail. On the day she died, the queen's last meal included a basket of figs. According to his account, her servants brought the fruit to her private chambers and hid an asp, the snake whose bite would end her life, beneath the sweet, ripe skins. The figs, a symbol of fertility and abundance, became the last taste of a world built on spectacle and power. The asp's venom did what no banquet ever could. It closed the era of Egypt's pharaohs in a single, silent act. Yet the food that ended Cleopatra's story was not a rare delicacy. Figs had been a staple for centuries, eaten by workers and royalty alike, their trees lining the fields beside the Nile. Even as the queen's feasts faded into legend, the basic staples of the poor, whole-grain bread, beans, onions, and fruit endured. Today, the same grains that filled the bellies of pyramid builders still form the backbone of Egyptian meals. Flatbreads baked from wheat and barley, lentil stews, and fresh onions appear on tables from Cairo to Aswan, connecting the present to a lineage older than the pyramids themselves. The irony is sharp. The food that once defined poverty now stands at the heart of what modern science calls the Mediterranean diet. While Cleopatra's banquets have vanished, the humble meals of Egypt's workers have survived, carrying forward a legacy of health and resilience that outlasted the queen, her kingdom, and every golden feast. In the end, it was not the luxury of the palace, but the endurance of the grain bowl that wrote Egypt's most lasting recipe. Today, nutritionists champion whole grains, legumes, onions, and fish, the very staples forced on Egypt's poorest workers. Power once meant feasts of rare meats and pearls dissolved in wine, but science now proves health belonged to those with no choice. As global diets shift and inequality grows, the lesson endures. Sometimes, history's humblest rations leave the deepest mark. What we eat reflects who truly holds power and who truly endures.